Welcome to the Set to Lead podcast, the online mentoring platform for emerging and current leaders. My name is Marianne Sambi, leadership coach and talent development expert, and I will be your host. Welcome to the show, Roger.
Hi, Marianne. Nice to be here.
I'm glad you're here today. Today's show is about creative ways to grow leaders and teams, and you happen to do that through music. Tell our listeners about what you do.
Well, I invented an activity called the music paradigm. It's a learning experience for organizations. Mm-hmm. And people are seated inside a live professional orchestra. And the orchestra is presented to them as a kind of a paradigm, a model for any organization. And then I invent role play exercises for the orchestra to do that mirror the kinds of challenges and ambitions that the organization has, and it enables people to see themselves more clearly. So not only is it a chance for them to experience music and to feel it more deeply than they have before, but also to see themselves and their behaviors at work with new insights that reveal people's powers that they hadn't realized that they had, options for the way they can behave, and enlightenment and understanding about what they do. Sounds improbable, doesn't it?
It does sound improbable, but extremely intriguing.
It is intriguing. I sometimes pinch myself about it, but I've been engaged to do this for many hundreds of organizations with more than 100 different orchestras around the world. Mm-hmm. So there's constantly evidence for me that it's not too good to be true, but actually does happen.
So what inspired this methodology?
Well, I was a conductor. I had a professional career. I was the music director for 2 orchestras. Mm-hmm. And I was very concerned about the state of the interest in classical music in our society. Mm-hmm. And I thought that if more people were interested, that so many things would get better. And so I began to challenge myself to find ways to introduce people to music and get them to feel it the way that I felt it. And so I designed this kind of learning experience. But after having launched it, I began to get this feedback that it had huge business value. And I started getting engaged by business organizations to present it at their most important meetings of the year. And that was when I got this huge feedback about how powerful it was and how much it mattered.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you talk about orchestra, for me personally, I think about me getting dressed up and going to Lincoln Center.
That is the way people think about it, right?
But for you,
that is part of the barrier. That is part of the barrier that people have to feeling music and having it as a meaningful part of their own emotional life and their spiritual life.
Mm-hmm. So are all your sessions held at a huge venue?
No, they're generally held wherever my clients' meetings are. Mm-hmm. Most often they're in hotel ballrooms, but sometimes they're in other locations as well.
Okay, so it can be an intimate group of musicians as well as a large string of musicians?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Mm-hmm. Because I did a session yesterday for about 20 participants. Mm-hmm. And then I've done sessions also for 2,000 participants. And in both cases, the audience is always facing the conductor, mm-hmm. not the usual position that the audience is in. And they're embedded amongst the musicians. So they're really experiencing the orchestra in a way that they've never imagined it before. And it's really hard not to get caught up in it because it's happening right in front of you. You feel the vibrations on your skin. You feel the energy that's required in order to make that sound. And it's just very compelling.
Now, that's interesting. I didn't know that you did that, but that was intentional on your part to make them face you, correct?
Right, exactly. You see, my goal was to get people to fall in love with music. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, well, I should put them where I fell in love with music myself. And I fell in love with music as a 10-year-old, sitting inside the school orchestra and feeling this electricity of the music flow through me as if I was a wire carrying electrical current. And I thought, well, that's where I want my audience to be. So they can feel that. It can at least be where I felt that. But that's not the only ingredient that's necessary, because many people have this kind of inhibition about classical music that you described so well, of feeling like it's only for people who are dressed up. And so I had to, in order to circumvent that inhibition, I had to change the subject. And so I didn't want it to be about music, because the moment people thought it was about music, they started having these notions that interfered with them actually hearing the music. So I changed the subject and made it about people's careers and what happens at work. But all the messages are carried by the live music. And so people get so fascinated in what the messages are that they forget that it's music, and then they've dropped their inhibition and the music reaches them much more deeply.
So how do you translate that metaphor into the work environment? Because you've talked about how you like your audience to be immersed in the pit, immersed with the musicians in front of you, so they can actually be at the core of all the action. Can we translate that metaphor into the workplace environment?
Well, sure. I'll give you an example. Mm-hmm. So, are you still there?
I'm still here.
Yeah. One of my clients was doing a huge business transformation, and they gave themselves 7 years to accomplish it. It was so big and so fundamental. And then they wisely thought that the only way this transformation, which was important but risky, the only way it was going to be a success was if the leadership throughout the entire organization really got behind it and enrolled the rest of the workforce. They didn't want people to just fix problems as they came up. They wanted to much more proactive kind of leadership. Right. So it was my job to communicate that to the audience. So what I did was I said, we're not going to play this passage, and the principal players, the principal flute, the principal trombone, all the principal players are going to be completely committed to the performance. But the rank and file of each section are going to do as little as possible without getting caught. And that draws some laughter, because people are very seldom asked to do that. Right. We know it happens all the time, but never has somebody asked people to do that. Well, so after the laughter, I start conducting the orchestra, and the orchestra plays. And it sounds fine. It sounds perfectly fine. And after a minute or so, I stop and I say, I see the surprised expressions on your faces. To a person, everybody is thinking that's perfectly fine. And I said, but why should that really surprise you? Because we all know that that's the way most organizations in the world work. That the people who are responsible and committed are so good that they carry it for all the other people who are basically doing much less than they could, but just don't feel that they could. They're invited to give their best. And you wouldn't think it was a dysfunction until you heard the following. Mm-hmm. And then I say to the orchestra, what would it be like if every single musician used everything you know to make this orchestra sound in a way that these people never imagined that an orchestra could sound? Well, that really gets the musicians motivated to play well, and they all do. And then they hear the identical music. Every note is exactly the same, but the effect of the music is completely different. The energy is so much more compelling, and they feel the sound on their skin and through their bodies, and they're overwhelmed by the sound. And after I stop the orchestra, I say that this is a very challenging demonstration for any leader, because if you're the type of leader who feels that your role is simply to solve problems when they come up and fix things when they need fixing, you will never draw that kind of energy and that kind of result. It's only the leader who sees what could possibly be and creates the circumstances where the workforce can achieve it that will ever draw this kind of result. So that's an example of how that concept is conveyed in a metaphorical way, but also a kind of powerful and disarming way that both fascinates the audience and also gives them a space to make the discovery themselves, rather than somebody telling them what to think.
That was an excellent example, Roger. Thank you for sharing that. Wow, that was definitely powerful. What have been some takeaways that the audience has shared with you in terms of what they got out of the observations they were making?
Well, you see, life unfolds at a certain speed, and it's the speed at which we live, and we're used to it. But the fact is that some of the way patterns of behavior that turn into results, we won't see the results until a long time later. It might be a week later, or it might be 2 weeks, it might be a month, and by the time the results of that behavior arrive, we no longer know what caused that result. We just know that there's a problem. In music, everything unfolds much faster, and so there's a direct connection between the invoking the behavior, and then you hear immediately what the result is. So in the realm of music, it's much easier to connect the dots. And when the behavior inside an organization is being presented to them in a metaphorical way, the orchestra becomes like a mirror in which they can see themselves. They see themselves as if they wish they could be, and they see themselves in ways that they don't want to acknowledge that they are, both the positive and the negative. And so people have these astonishing insights about their situation, about their behavior, about their mindset. So it's very challenging. You begin to see that you have more power than you thought. You begin to see that you are the source of a lot of the situations that bother you. And you begin to realize that you can actually do a lot more to shape your life into the way you would like it to be.
As a conductor, Roger, when you're in practice mode with your musicians, out of curiosity, when you're practicing music and it doesn't come out right, how do you coach those musicians to excellence? Is it the same way you coach individuals to excellence?
It's a very good question.
Thank you.
I think that most of the way that I behave in my life is informed by what I do as a musician, because music is so important to me. Right now, I happen to be looking out at the window at some trees that are blowing in the wind, and I look at that and I feel the rhythm of it, and I feel kind of the phrasing of it. I see and experience music everywhere. So when the orchestra plays in a way that I think is, I wouldn't say it's wrong, but it's not what it could be. It's not as beautiful as it could be. It's not as powerful. It's not as meaningful. So my job is to figure out, to give them some kind of direction that helps them to achieve that result. But because they're professional musicians and they're very experienced and they're really good, it's not enough for me to just give them directions that they obey. That's what people think that conductors do. But it's a much tougher job than that, because musicians don't necessarily want to do what the conductor asks them to do. And if they really don't like it, they won't do it. And in that way, it's just like any other workforce.
Right.
People can be forced to comply, but then you get a kind of like, you never get the best result. You never get what people have to offer.
Right.
So the question is, how do you give a direction that gets people enthusiastic about enrolling in the vision that you've laid out?
Yes.
And there's a real art to how to do that. So that's what I do with orchestras. I have a vision in my mind about the way the music could be. I hear what the orchestra is doing. I subtract one from the other, and I get a kind of a gap analysis. This is the gap that if I close that gap, I'll get closer to the way it should be. So now the directions are just how to close that gap. And there are many ways to do it. And of course, you feel the chemistry in the orchestra, you see the concentration level, the awareness level, and you become like a diagnostician about what lever to pull, what button to push in order to get the whole orchestra to embrace a new way of doing it.
Very interesting how the whole musician scenario mimics real life.
Exactly. That's the whole point. That it really does. The more you know about it, the more you realize that it's just like real life, except, as I say, it's happening faster and you can connect the dots. That behavior leads to results immediately. And so it's a fantastic laboratory for taking really almost any issue that happens in real life. And since I know a lot about the orchestra, I designed these role plays that will grow spontaneously in the orchestra, the situations that are happening in real life, and give people a chance to contemplate them.
Right. Listening is also an important skill set around good music, correct?
Very important, really crucial.
Crucial.
Listening is being in the present. You know, if you're distracted and your mind starts to wander and you're thinking about something else, you're going to play out of tune. Mm-hmm. Because playing in tune is about really being in the moment and reading exactly where the pitch is in the group and then making sure that you fit in with it. Mm-hmm. So listening is being present. Listening also involves valuing the composite of what many people do as much as you value what you yourself are doing. Mm-hmm. A lot of listening comes from the attitude that there's something for me in what somebody else is saying, and I'm willing to stay with that. Whereas the reason that many people stop listening is because they get caught up in what they want to say, what they want to convey. And that is it's kind of trying to control the situation in the gentlest of way. Of course, you're not bullying anybody, but mm-hmm. what you're doing is you're abandoning them in order to entertain what you yourself want to convey, what the impression is that you want to make. So all these things come up through the exploration of the act of listening.
It's very difficult to teach listening skills, Roger. Our educational system spends a lot of time showing us how to read, how to speak, but not much time is spent on teaching people how to listen. What are some example role plays you might use, or a role play you might use in your orchestra setup to teach a professional how to listen better?
Well, here's one thing that I frequently do. Mm-hmm. In every session that I do, I ask the orchestra to play without conductor. And people are quite surprised to see that it's the easiest thing in the world for the orchestra to do. And then after that, I ask them to change it. I say, play it in a different style, play it in a different tempo, make it sound like a different composer. I give them these spontaneous directions, and the orchestra has to invent it immediately. And it's incredible how fast they negotiate it. In the course of one note, they have arrived on how they're going to do it. Well, people are really surprised to see that happen right in front of them. Mm-hmm. And it's obvious to everybody that this is not rehearsed, that this is real. So then I'll hand the microphone to some musician and I'll say, well, how did you do that? And I really quiz the musician. I probe their answers because I want them to describe exactly what they went through just then. And they talk about how they're reading the sound that the orchestra is making, and they're full of anticipation based on one note that just played. They're trying to figure out, well, probably the next phrase is going to go this way. And so there's this active anticipating in the orchestra. And at the same time, there's this tracking of what's happening now and having the goal that adapting is the priority. So that's one of the ways, but I'm not teaching the lesson. The musician is teaching the lesson about it.
Interesting. I could speak to you for hours about this because I find it so intriguing and it's so creative. And I think the element of creativity also adds to the learning exercise. It's different. So people are more engaged because this is a thought-provoking way to teach.
Yeah, and it becomes like a game that everybody's playing. And I make sure that the atmosphere in the room is very, very lighthearted, and there's a lot of laughter, and people get very relaxed about it. But I'll give you one thing one way that I transfer the kind of listening and music into real life. Let's say there's a meeting that let's say I'm chairing. Well, one of the things that you learn as a conductor is that you have to listen really, really very well. But that's not the end of your responsibility. You're also accountable for the way the musicians listen to each other. You have to create the conditions in which the musicians want to listen to each other.
Okay, and how do you do that? Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll tell you how I do it with an orchestra first, mm-hmm. and then I'll tell you how I do it when it's not music.
Okay.
So with an orchestra, I get them, I focus their attention around a particular thing that's happening. I'd say, make sure everybody is listening to the double basses here, the pulse and the double basses, and they play again, and I hear that they're not listening to them because they're playing a little too early and they're not hearing all the notes and bass. And I stop them and I say, I don't think you're connecting with the basses. Just listen to them. And if they haven't done it, then I'll say, just listen to the basses play alone. Nobody else play. And I'll say, make sure you can hear them. But what I'm doing is I'm taking a particular detail and I won't let the orchestra go on until everybody is really hearing it. So I'm making them accountable for listening. Now, the way I do it in real life is, let's say I'm in a meeting and I have the sense that not everybody is not exactly there. It's not only somebody who might be on their cell phone, which is, completely not being there, but I can tell, I read their facial expressions and I can see whether they're concentrated or not. So after somebody speaks, I'll call on the person that I felt was not concentrating and I'll say, I'm not sure I got what John just said. Would you put that in your own words? And if they weren't listening, they have well, now they're on the spot and right. They have to say something. And I'll say, well, thanks, that's great. John, do you think that caught what you were saying? And John says, well, no, I don't think that's really what I said. I'll say, well, say it again, what you said. And then I'll turn to the second guy, the non-John guy, and I say, well, do you agree with what John said? Why do you think that's important? So I'm asking these questions, which are forcing them to be there and holding them accountable for listening. And that's very effective. Once they see that it's happening, that that's the kind of room it is where people are accountable for listening, it's amazing how much they listen.
Keyword, accountability, and also the role you have as the conductor to facilitate.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
You see, conductors do a lot more facilitating than they do commanding. And people don't understand that. But conductors are really good facilitators. They have all this talent in front of them. And their job is to mobilize the talent around a single purpose and to get everybody to enroll in that purpose so that they're really working together.
Before we close out, because we've come to a close, Roger, I have one.
Do we have to close out? Because this has been so much fun.
Oh, I know, right? I don't want to close out, but we're going to close out this session, and maybe you come back another time for part 2. But I have a silly question. You're going to think it's silly, but I've always wondered about this when it comes to conductors. Why do you guys conduct with the stick?
Excellent question. You know, there are a lot of conductors who don't.
I've never seen that.
Yeah, it does happen.
Okay.
Not the majority, but some people do.
Okay.
And then sometimes that I will, for a moment, I'll put down the stick and use just my hands. But most of the time I do use a stick. And in classical music, it can be pretty complicated. And things can happen very, very quickly. Like you have a passage where the violins play like that. Well, that never happens in pop music. It never happens. And it's not a song.
Maybe in a rap song.
Not that fast in rap. Nobody could understand that. It's just this dexterity of the instruments when they're mastered. And so it's happening very fast. And the little pieces of time mean a lot. And you want to be able to define time for the orchestra extremely clearly. So you want no ambiguity about when is now and when is the next now. And so these clicks of the stick and the motion of the stick is very articulate. And the other thing about the stick is that you can feel the flow of the stick through space. And sometimes with my conducting students, I ask them to imagine that they're moving that stick not through air, but through water. And what would that feel like? And then I ask them to imagine, suppose it's a substance which is much thicker than water. How will that stick move? And so what the stick is doing is, even though it's just the stick, it's defining the space through which it's moving. And by doing that, you're defining something about the music itself and the effect of the music. So the baton is just an incredibly useful vehicle for conveying a lot of things about the work, the way the work should be done.
Thank you, Roger. I've always wondered. But before we end, let the community know the best way to follow you and your work.
My website is musicparadigm.com, and there you'll find all kinds of blogs and videos and other interesting things, and also how to find out about the book that I wrote.
And what's the name of the book that you wrote?
It's called Maestro, A Surprising Story About Leading by Listening.
Thank you, Roger. It was a pleasure.
For me too.